Welcome back, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery here. Thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. Part 4 today in this 18-part series that looks at the history of Chinese philosophy. We're still in the spring and autumn period. This was during China's Bronze Age. And we're talking about Confucius. So let's pick up from where we left off last time in Part 3. Confucius, still living on the road, searching for that perfect ruler. The life of an itinerant philosopher living on the run was a hard one. People from rock stars to traveling salesmen will attest to that. Plenty of times, Kongzi and his entourage of disciples faced these life and death situations. And I'm sure the transport back in the early 500s BCE wasn't that great either. As an advisor to the Qi ruler Duke Jing, Kongzi wasn't being taken seriously. And like with everyone else, he found this ruler of Qi lacking in virtue. Duke Ai of Lu, who reigned 494 to 467 BCE, brought Confucius back home again in 483, or so says the Zhuozhuan. Believe it or not, there was this sort of rivalry between Lu and Qi. Rulers of both rival states vied with each other to keep the famous Confucius in their camp, even though they didn't heed his advice. Each would try and entice Kongzi to come to their capital to teach. But Master Kong returned to Lu for good, and it was there, with Confucius pushing 70 years old, he finished off his days teaching and being accorded all the reverence and respect that many a great teacher has enjoyed over the millennia. His last years were spent working on the Book of Songs, also called the Book of Odes, the Shi Jing. He also devoted a great deal of time on the Shangshu, the Book of Documents, as well as the Chunqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals, from which we get the name of that half of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. The Chunqiu chronicles the years of Lu's state from 722 to 481 BCE. Confucius also spent his final years trying to figure out the I Ching. That he began to study it so late in life was one of Master Kong's dying regrets. What he wrote about the I Ching had some rather profound consequences. Kongzi didn't know it back then, that he'd end up as famous and long-lasting as he ended up being, longest social and political philosophy in history, you could argue. I suppose he might have felt thankful having achieved, in his own time, some degree of success as a teacher of students who had risen far in the government. But as far as his greatest goal of finding that one virtuous ruler who he could latch on to and guide, Confucius never got to achieve that. In fact, in some places Kongzi went to, he was downright disparaged and physically mistreated. When he passed in 479 BCE, he was given quite a send-off by his disciples, who were said to number something like 77. Some were more famous than others. His grandson Zisi was maybe the most famous. Confucius had a son, but I guess the only achievement this son had was siring Zisi. His disciples mourned him for 3 years. I'm sure Confucius would have insisted, even though this was a period of time only reserved for one's parents' passing. At the time of his death, Kongzi was just one of many teachers and philosophers in China. But like Elvis and James Dean, Confucius ended up much bigger in death than in life. What followed in the wake of Confucius's life was an explosion in Chinese philosophy and philosophers. By Kongzi's time, this became the preferred career for many an aspiring scholar. Luoyang, for a while, became the Silicon Valley of philosophers. Mengzi was one of the many who made the trip there. Soon after the great sage's passing, Chinese history entered the Warring States period, a time of great violence and misery, but also an extremely fertile period for philosophy. The 100 schools of thought argued everything, and many books were written. Well, paper wasn't invented yet, but strips of bamboo was what they used. A whole kaleidoscope of philosophical writings burst onto the scene. Although Confucius enjoyed some degree of shine in his own lifetime, the true reason why he managed to attain the longevity he did was all due to his disciples. How far might Christianity have gone without Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the apostles? Same with Confucianism. Yeah, later on there are certain works that are attributed to Confucius, but he personally didn't leave any books behind. It's said Confucius played some role in editing and compiling many of the canonical texts that became known as the 13 Confucian classics, the Jing. He's also credited with producing the 10 wings or commentaries to the Zhou, the changes of Zhou. But honestly, everything we have that managed to make it down to the modern age were the teachings and quotations of Confucius as remembered and written down by his disciples and others who followed the great sage a century or even centuries later. Confucius did not dwell so much on a person's innate nature. Are you born good or born bad? Mengzi said good, Xunzi said not so. But Kongzi, he didn't make this such a big issue. He was a big picture person, I guess you could say. Without getting lost in all the quotes that I have extracted from the 4 books and the Lunyu in particular, let me try to encapsulate what Confucius was all about. What was important to him? How did he look at things? If you love metaphysics, Kongzi isn't your philosopher. He was concerned only with human affairs, and his passion was taking his thought and applying it to the government leadership, operation, and administration. His focus was on matters like how everyone in society should conduct themselves, at home, in public, and in certain other situations. Etiquette was everything. Of the 13 Confucian classics, 3 deal only with this subject: the rites of Zhou, ceremonies and rites, and the Book of Rites, the Zhou Li, Yi Li, and the Li Ji. Confucius believed all these ancient rites that had been ignored or carried out half-heartedly for so many years had to be done right. All of these rites, ancestor worship included, had to be done with all seriousness. You had to really show up and be in the moment. That's why things had turned to you-know-what. Rulers and top officials demonstrated the worst regard for morality and ethics and setting an example for their subjects. So it was no wonder the character of the Lao Bai Xing, the people, had also degraded. If you would ask Confucius what kind of teacher he was, he'd tell you he didn't teach anything. All he did was reintroduce the wisdom and examples and the Dao of the ancient sage rulers. And Confucius pointed to them, Yao most of all, as we saw last episode. And he said, these people were worth emulating, especially in these dark times in the late spring and autumn period. And the reason for lack of peace throughout the land was because everyone, the rulers most of all, had strayed too far from the perfect example set by Yao. Kongzi looked at the family as the national social system of China. Everything, as I said, began with the ruler who sets the moral example to his subjects. Morality, so central to Confucian thought. The ruler's in the Confucian way of thinking, rubbed off on the people. And the people, seeing the moral example of their ruler, passed this decency, this idea of onto the younger generations. We translate as morality, but it goes beyond that. It's morality and more. Confucius said, one who rules by moral force may be compared to the North Star. It occupies its place, and all stars pay homage to it. It was totally up to the family, and no one else, to teach their children and get this generation involved in perpetuating these old traditions, these rituals of Li. This was the mechanism that united the state, the people, and heaven. All inclusively. Everyone was in it together. This idea will be advanced in leaps and bounds over the centuries that followed. It was up to the family, most importantly perhaps, to pass on to the next generation, knowing how to carry out and participate in all these traditional ceremonies and rituals and knowing your place and your role inside the family and outside the family. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 5 bonds, the Wuchang. This was one of the hallmarks of Confucianism. In order of importance, these 5 relationships were between the ruler to the ruled, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. You could say this kind of thinking had some staying power, lasting into modern times, especially with the last four of the five. Mobility in those BCE days, social or otherwise, was limited. People stayed where they were. These knights errant, or wuxia wanderers I mentioned in part 1, they were a tiny fraction of the population. Generally speaking, back then, there was none of this leaving the village to go work in a coastal city. The civil service exams hadn't been invented yet. Nobody went anywhere. And it was within this context that Kongzi and all of these early philosophers produced their thought. The dynamic of that time shaped their thought every much as the events of the last years of the Qing dynasty, clear through to May 4th, 1919, shaped Mao Zedong thought. These philosophers were very much products of their times. As a remedy to all of these 5th century BCE ills, Kongzi taught the 5 constants and the 4 virtues. These qualities were the essence of what constituted the Zhenren, or the perfect person. Confucius said that of the 5 constants, the 2 that mattered most were Ren and Yi, benevolence and righteousness. Rounding out the list were Li, etiquette, Zhi, knowledge, and Xin, integrity. The 4 virtues were loyalty, filial piety, self-control, and for the second time, righteousness. Do the right thing. Being righteous, that was both a constant and a virtue. I couldn't help but recall from my youth, Highlights magazine. They had this comic strip called Goofus and Gallant. They were 2 brothers, and you could guess which one was the good one and which one was the ne'er-do-well. It was written in a way that said, Goofus does it this way and Gallant does it that way. Well, Confucius and the Analects had so many stories that illustrated the difference between what he called the xiaoren, the small person or lower person, compared with that of the junzi, the gentleman or higher person. Stuff like, what the higher man seeks in himself, the lower man seeks in others. I mentioned in last episode, many centuries before Jesus or Hillel Hagadol, Kongzi had this exchange between himself and his disciple Zi Gong, who asked, is there one word with which to act in accordance throughout a lifetime? The master said, is not reciprocity such a word? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. And furthermore, when Confucius said, when performing what Rabbi Hillel might have called a mitzvah, Confucius said, do the good deed for the sake of doing it as a natural reaction, out of the true goodness of your heart. If you do someone a solid for the sake of some hidden agenda, or to acquire future favors or gains of some sort, that's what a xiaoren does, a small person. That's worse than not doing the deed at all. Surely you've seen on Twitter when someone talks up a good deed they did, feeding the homeless perhaps, and they frame it in such a way that screams out, hey, look what I did. Then they get shredded online with all this invective that, unbeknownst to them, is very Confucian. They call them out and say they're calling attention to themselves for doing a good deed. It negates the whole act. Do it to do it, not to make yourself look like some sort of hero. The junzi, the gentleman, was the opposite of the xiaoren in every way. There's no female junzi. Confucius wasn't a feminist, let's just say that. Time and again throughout the writings of Kongzi, he spoke about the junzi. The 2 Chinese characters, Jun and Zi, literally translate to prince's son. The Junzi, or Chinese gentleman, had it all in one single package. Contained in his physical and spiritual person was someone who always knew how to act appropriately in every situation. Someone who had all the virtues and traits one needed to properly follow the Dao. Not the Taoist Dao, the Confucian Dao, the Confucian way of how a human ought to live their lives and conduct themselves as taught to posterity by the sage kings of old. The acts of a junzi are repeatedly discussed in the Confucian Analects. He held them up as the ethical nobility. As I said, they need not come from the upper classes. In this world that Confucius lived, what mattered was your deportment, Example after example is given about how a junzi acts and does things and how a junzi thinks. And it's always the xiaoren, the small person, who is held up as the gentleman's shameful opposite. A junzi understands what is moral. The small man understands what is profitable. Confucius says the junzi, as opposed to the small person, had the following traits. 1. In regard to the use of their eyes, they are anxious to see clearly. 2. In regard to their countenance, they are anxious that it should be benign. 3. In regard to their demeanor, they are anxious that it should be respectful. 4. In regard to their speech, they are anxious that it should be sincere. 5. In regard to doing business, they are anxious that it should be done reverently, careful. 6. In regard to what they doubt, they are anxious to question others. 7. When they are angry, they think of the difficulties their anger may involve them in. 8. When they see gain to be made, they think of righteousness. Can you imagine a world where everyone thought this way? The way that Confucius called for an orderly society with a number of social classes where everyone knew their place and nobody rocked the boat was probably a good idea at the time. Considering the violence and random chaos of the Warring States period, it was natural to hope for solutions that offered, first and foremost, something that curbed violence and promoted tranquility. Even in today's most violent and unstable regions of the world, some people are willing to lower the bar as far as their personal hopes and aspirations for the sake of peace and a cessation of violence. Let me give you some quotes from the Lunyu. This is known in the English-speaking world as the Analects of Confucius. Basically, it's a collection of sayings that are attributed to Kongzi. It's believed that they were conversations Kongzi had with his disciples and that not long after the passing of the great sage, they were written down. So we can believe, if we choose to, that if these aren't the actual words of Kongzi, they at least contain the spirit of what he thought. Not all, but most of the Chinese classics that we find today were written in the Han Dynasty. The original texts have all either been lost or destroyed, and the final form that most of these classics took in the Han Dynasty don't match up exactly to the Zhou Dynasty versions. Confucius would make these statements, and then endless discussion would follow about what he said and meant. This resulted in all kinds of exciting philosophical ideas that would come out of these core statements. Here's some of Kongzi's greatest hits. Some of you might hear these words and be reminded of some of the lessons you learned in Sunday school. Respect yourself, and others will respect you. To be wealthy and honored in an unjust society is a disgrace. Fine words and an ingratiating demeanor are seldom associated with true virtue. When the wind blows, the grass bends. Here, Kongzi means if the ruler is virtuous and benevolent, he's like the wind, and his force will naturally impact the people who are, in this instance, the grass. Lead people with administrative injunctions and put them in their place with penal law, and they will avoid punishments, but will be without a sense of shame. Lead them with excellence and put them in their place through roles and ritual practices, and in addition to developing a sense of shame, they will order themselves harmoniously. If names be not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success. When affairs cannot be carried on to success, proprieties and music do not flourish. This was another one of Kongzi's passions. The ming, or name of something, was extremely important. The nobler type of man is broad-minded and not prejudiced. The inferior man is prejudiced and not broad-minded. When we see men of worth, we should think of equaling them. When we see men of a contrary character, we should turn inwards and examine ourselves. Okay, let's pack up our rucksacks and call it a day. Next time we're all together, we'll look at how Confucianism became what it ultimately became. In his own lifetime, Confucius was just another philosopher, but in death, he attained immortality. That's all for next time in Part 5. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. Thanks for listening, and do consider joining me next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.